Hello, and welcome to Religion and Life. I'm your host, Ozzy Oswald. Climate care is of special interest and importance to all of us as global citizens.
We have endless debates about the proper ways to address climate change and environmental needs. It turns out that religion and spirituality have much to contribute to these debates. My guest, the Reverend Anna Shine, is St. Luke's Episcopal Church's missioner for creation care and social justice, and knows a thing or two about religion's role in caring for our earth. Welcome, Anna.
Hi.
Thank you for joining me today. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, you've got a great biography and very interesting history with education. Why don't you just start by telling us a little bit about yourself, how you came to be an Episcopal priest, and it's really interesting.
Yeah, well, how I became an Episcopal priest. That's a long story. So I guess what I'll say is that I've always had a fascination with religion. I grew up Episcopalian, and I had a fascination with history and with language and art and culture, and so religion just kind of gave me the umbrella to be able to study all of those things.
You not only grew up Episcopalian, but you grew up in St. Luke's, the
did.
local Episcopal church, where you work now.
Yes, I did, which is pretty amazing. It's not often that you get to work in the church where you grew up and where you were raised, so I see that as a particular honor.
No, that's great. So your title is missioner, is that correct?
Yes.
Is that, I'm unfamiliar with that title. Is that something unique to the Episcopal Church, or can you tell us a little bit about what that role entails?
Sure. I don't know that it's unique to the Episcopal Church. I think the language is more just because part of my work deals with the wider diocese, which is Western North Carolina. And so because I do some of my work for the bishop's office and some of my work for a local church, missioner is taking care of the whole mission and not just one particular area.
Oh. So you're kind of back and forth between the local church and the kind of go-between with the diocese.
Yes, because I work in campus ministry, that is a diocesan position, and so that makes me part of the bishop's staff.
It sounds to me like you have 3 jobs, or maybe more. I'm not sure.
I wear a lot of hats.
Okay. And your particular focus, or part of your title, is missioner for creation care and social justice. That's interesting. Can you tell me a little bit about that? I want to come back to that, particularly the creation care part, but is that a unique position, or is that something that you would find across the Episcopal spectrum?
Yeah, I think that it is in some ways a unique position, but also I think within the Episcopal tradition there is a growing community of people doing work in creation care, and most of the time when you're doing work in creation care, that intersects with social justice issues as well.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about that later, because I think a lot of time people don't connect those dots between environmental justice and social justice, but they are interrelated.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
we'll talk a little bit about that later. I was interested, just for my own edification, to hear a little bit about your education, because you have a BA in religious studies, you have from Elon, and these are all really high-powered schools, a Master of Theological Studies from Harvard Divinity, and a Master of Divinity from Virginia Theological Seminary. I would like to hear you articulate the difference between a Master's in Theological Studies and a Master's in Divinity. I know there is a difference, but I'd like to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, sure. So Master's in Divinity is the degree that's required if you're seeking ordination, and that's a 3-year degree program. And a Master's in Theological Studies is usually a 2-year program that does not end with ordination, and also it allows for a variety of focus areas in study. So for example, when I did my Master's of Theological Studies, I was focusing more on Islam and Judaism rather than Christianity. And so with a specific focus area on women, gender, and religion.
I'm just wondering, with that background, were you thinking about doctoral studies at some point and professorate? And
Yes, I was. And actually, it was while I was trying to work on my PhD personal statement that God laughed and said, "Hey, have you considered being ordained?" And that started my whole process
well,
towards
there's
the
time
priesthood.
still for the PhD.
Yeah,
Right?
maybe one day.
Maybe one day. Yeah. Okay. So Islam and Judaism was your focus for the MTS.
Yeah.
Do you do work across traditions now, or between Christianity, Judaism, and Islam ever? That kind of interfaith stuff, is that part of your focus?
I don't know that it's part of my focus, but we have a multi-faith leadership and clergy group that meets, and that gives me opportunities to learn from and meet with other faith traditions, including the Islamic Center of Boone, the Temple of the High Country, Baha'i. Yeah.
Well, I think probably the High Country is a little more diverse than people give it credit for, because you just mentioned three traditions that people normally don't think about. You know, we count up the different types of Baptists, but we forget about Baha'i and Islam and Judaism and others.
Yeah.
I read a little bit of your biography, and you mentioned that you have a kind of interesting faith journey that culminated in an experience at the Wild Goose Festival. Tell me about the Wild Goose Festival. I've never been, but I've heard about this, and I'd like to hear about your experiences there.
Sure. So I had just graduated from my master's in theological studies, and my older sister had just graduated from Virginia Theological Seminary the same year, and she was going on to be ordained a priest, and I was thinking about PhD programs, and at that time did not consider myself Christian, which, again, ironic that
So
now I'm a priest.
You grew up in the Episcopal Church, and you'd finished 2 religion degrees, but you felt like you had left the faith, or
more left the institution.
okay.
And
Okay.
so it wasn't that I didn't have faith in God. I more so had mistrust in human institutions for the history of abuse and oppression and horrible things that have happened within institutions. But I wasn't someone who considered myself spiritual but not religious, in the sense of having my own faith but not having a community to practice with.
Right.
And so I was searching for that community. What would it look like? Who would it be? And so I went to the Wild Goose Festival with my mom and my older sister, and I went kind of kicking and screaming because I didn't want to be around a bunch of committed Christians who were going to ask me what I was doing with my life now that I had just graduated. And ironically, it was there that I found people who were open. It felt like a space where the Holy Spirit was still moving, and it was less about rigid institution and dogma and more about living the life that Jesus promotes. And so for me, that was a breath of fresh air, and I thought, well, maybe I shouldn't give up just yet on Christianity in particular.
And the Wild Goose Festival, for those who don't know, is kind of a 3 or 4 day event, week-long event with music and speakers, authors, and religious leaders. And
yeah, it has a focus on social justice, on art, on music, and coming together to learn and grow.
Yeah, I have to go to one of those.
Yeah, highly
and
recommend
it was
it.
in Hot Springs, North Carolina, I think.
Yes.
That first time you went. Now they've moved, but is it always in North Carolina? Is this a homegrown kind of thing, or is it a more broadly southeastern United States?
It has been located in North Carolina, but people come from all over.
Okay.
for it, yeah.
Well, let's shift gears a little bit. Since your title includes creation care, can you tell us from the perspective of the church, or the perspective of Christianity in this case, what you mean by creation care? How would you define that?
Sure. Most simply, creation care is just care for creation. The way I understand and perceive it is as a recognition of the inherent sacredness and value that is within all that has been created in my worldview by God. And because of that inherent value and dignity and worth, then the call to care for, take care of, to steward and nourish and grow and heal that creation, which we're a part of. And when I say creation, I mean more than just the human side of it, but
environment, the animal world,
water, air, plants.
So has there been, I don't know quite how to say this, is there unanimity among Christians that this is a value that we should be actively pursuing? Or are there parts of the Christian world where maybe environmental care takes a back seat to other, issues and values and things that people would see worth pursuing?
Yeah, I think there's a growing movement for it within Christianity, but I don't know that it is emphasized necessarily across the board in every tradition. But I do see it as something that is growing within Christianity.
So there's a wonderful story in the book of Genesis, which is part of the Jewish and Christian scriptures, about Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and God gives a command to Adam to subdue the earth and to make use of it, which is a kind of utilitarian view of the relationship between human beings and the world. But you mentioned the word stewardship as well. Is there, within some Christian communities, is there a clash between that utilitarian view that the earth is here for human well-being and that we can use it however we want, versus a more, as you said, nourishing perspective where human beings have a responsibility to care for the globe and the earth?
Yeah, I think it's a matter of interpretation and how it has been interpreted throughout history. I interpret it differently. And if you speak to anyone who knows me well, I will geek out on this all the time. But for me, so there are two creation narratives in Genesis, and the first one is the creation in 7 days, with it ending with Sabbath rest. And it's in that creation narrative that the subdue and have dominion comes into play.
Right.
And if you look at the Hebrew, it's pretty clear what it says. So I'm not someone who says, oh, well, let's just translate it differently. I want to wrestle with what the text actually says. So it does say subdue and have dominion. However, that's in the context of a story that says, and God saw that it was good. And God saw that it was good. That occurs in the story, I think 6 times. And then at the culmination of the story of the creation of the cosmos, of the universe, humanity is created. And ironically, it doesn't say, and God saw that it was good after humanity is created, which I think is telling.
Yeah.
But what happens is then there's an explanation of what is the role and what are you to eat and how are you to be. And it does have subdue and have dominion over it in there. And then it says, and God saw that it was very good, when everything is in the right order. So for me, I find it difficult to look at a story that talks about the goodness inherent in all of creation and say subdue and have dominion means exploit and abuse and harm. The story that often allows us to exploit and cause harm and have more of a utilitarian viewpoint is what Christians often call the fall narrative of Adam and Eve in the garden and the eating of the fruit of the tree and all of that. But that happens after, in the second creation narrative. And so I think putting that on top of a story that has to do about goodness is problematic. And if we think in terms of a Christian worldview, dominion is a language around ruling, kingship, if we understand God as ruler, and if we understand Jesus as part of God, then Jesus is our model for what rule should look like. So what does dominion look like in the context of a story, a narrative of Jesus as king? Well, Jesus came to serve, not to be served. So if that's the model we're given, then shouldn't dominion look like serving that which is created?
Yeah.
That's how I've kind of come to understand it.
Yeah.
And the other part of it is in that second creation narrative with Adam and Eve being created, there's a leveling. In the first story, there is kind of this hierarchy of light and water and air, and at the end, humanity is created after the creatures and all of that. But in the second story, Adam is created out of the ground, and the trees are formed out of the ground, and the animals and the birds are formed out of the ground. So there's this leveling that occurs where everything is created out of the same material, and there's no greater value or worth.
Yeah.
So
That's really well said. I like it when you geek out on something. So you said that with great passion.
I get excited about it.
Yeah, I could tell. So your excitement has been noticed by others because you were recently chosen as one of only 17 delegates to represent the Episcopal Church at the 2024 United Nations Climate Change Conference. That's very impressive.
Thank you.
Tell me a little bit about this conference held in Azerbaijan, but I think you were an online participant, as most people were. It was mostly remote. But what was this all about? And tell us a little bit about this conference, because it's very impressive in my mind.
Thank you. Yes, so this is the 29th Conference of Parties, which is COP. So COP 29 for the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which we say UNFCCC for short. It's a mouthful.
Yeah.
So these have been occurring now. This is the 29th meeting of the Conference of Parties, and this one took place in Azerbaijan. And this is an opportunity for members of the United Nations to gather specifically for this conference to talk about what's going on with climate change and how it impacts the globe, and what are our commitments to doing something about this. And each year seems to have a little bit of a different theme. The Episcopal Church, we've been participating, if I remember correctly, since COP 21, which was 2015 in Paris, where the Paris Agreement was signed, which stipulated a lot of agreements that countries came together to commit to keeping our globe within 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming. So all of the efforts since then have been towards finding ways to mitigate global warming and climate change, ways to adapt from the impacts of climate change, and more recently, ways to fund and help against loss and damage which occurs from climate change incidents. And so this particular one focused specifically on the financing and how are we going to pay to be able to do the mitigation, to be able to adapt, and to be able to pay for the economic loss and actual damage that occurs from storms.
Right.
Yeah.
So you said the Episcopal Church has been involved with this for 8 or 9 years, and there are other faith traditions that have representatives there. What was the role for you all as representatives of these faith traditions? Because I'm assuming this is not just a religion conference, right? There are other institutions and other representatives there as well. What role did the faith communities have in this conference?
Yeah. So I can't speak for all of the faith communities, but my understanding is that part of what we do is we've been given observer status. So what that means is, as an observer member, we are allowed to enter what's called the blue zone, which is where negotiations take place. So that means that we have access to watching the informal session, some of the sessions that are going on around negotiating these different agreements that come to then pass later in the conference. And so part of the role that the faith community brings is a reminder of what is the moral thing to do right now, giving a human perspective and a personal perspective on what is the story of what this means, the impacts of how what you decide, what that does, giving the big picture view, but also providing some of the policy priorities that different faith communities have that mostly strive towards justice and making sure that there's equity and inclusion, human rights are being talked about and held up. So I think a lot of it has to do with just being present. There's a lot of prayer. That's an important aspect for those of us within faith traditions. So praying, but also listening and hearing people's stories, being witness to what is happening, and being able to share that with our communities and come back to our communities, but also take what our communities have decided are important policy priorities and take that to the negotiators and say, hey, here's where we stand on these things. And as members within your civil societies, we care about this.
Do you feel heard as a faith community, you think?
That's a really good question. I think in some ways, yes. I mean, we're 17 delegates,
Right.
you know, but we bring with us the prayers and the priorities of our tradition. When I represent the Episcopal Church as a delegate to this conference, I'm not going with my own personal opinions or ideas. I represent the church that sent me. And so the way we form these priorities is through resolutions that have been passed by what we call General Convention, which is a gathering of deputies and bishops and delegates who pass resolutions and pass other things to make the church continue to run. And so the language that we use in our priorities are dependent upon the language that's used in the resolutions that have been passed. And so part of what we can do is we can come back to our convention and say, hey, there are these issues that are really important and we'd like to be able to talk to negotiators about this, but we can't speak it until we've been given language.
Right.
Maybe let's pass some resolutions around this. And it also brings more awareness to the full community. Because the Episcopal Church, I don't know how many people are aware, but it's not just the United States. I think there are 17 countries that are part of the Episcopal Church, and so we're an international community, and so we're also part of the Anglican Communion, so we're connected by this great network. And one of the things that I think we hear a lot at these conferences is the discrepancy between what the global north is experiencing versus what the global south is experiencing. And because we are connected to people from other countries, and particularly small island nations and the global south, we can hear the stories of what people are experiencing there and share that with some of the people who might have more ability to do something about that.
Well,
That's the hope.
Yeah, well, that's great. And a couple of things you just mentioned is a good segue to making this connection between issues of environmental justice and social justice. You've mentioned that a couple of times. Can you kind of articulate that, how these two come together? Issues surrounding climate care, how does that impact social justice efforts? And is it all directed toward the global south, or is it more broadly focused than that?
Yeah, no, I don't think it's just directed toward the global south, but I think one of the things that we see within the climate crisis is just a continuation of some of the social justice issues that already exist. So within environmental impacts, climate crisis issues, there's also a discrepancy on, environmental racism, the ways in which communities of color are more heavily impacted by issues of water, health and safety, air pollution, waste sites being located in poorer and community of color communities. So those parallel the issues that already exist and are exacerbated by what happens with a climate that is changing and that is becoming more dangerous. And what we see is that these global south countries, the small island nations, many of them are facing the harshest impacts of the climate crisis, despite the fact that they did not contribute the most of the emissions that have caused the changes we're seeing.
So what are, in a little bit of time we have left, what are some of the things that the church can do, or some of the things that we can do to bring greater awareness to the impact that the climate crisis has on social justice issues? What are some of the ways that we can address some of these things?
Well, that's the ultimate question, right?
Yeah.
So part of it is informing ourselves, becoming more aware of what is actually going on. A lot of the stories that I hear, that I've heard though from these conferences, are around the importance of doing both local work and international global work. It's a both and situation. So focusing on what is already happening at home and how can we participate in things that are going well, and how can we notice things that maybe need more attention. One of the biggest things that I think is powerful is that the only constituency at these conferences that stays the same is civil society. Delegates can be removed because of elections, right? The same people aren't necessarily coming to negotiate every single time, because elections happen, systems change. But civil society, us, we're always here. And civil society has the ability and the power to hold our societies accountable to what it is that they promise or commit to. Making sure that we hold them accountable is part of the work we can do to help our neighbors make sure that they're being cared for as well.
Well, I am so happy you're doing this work. I'm so proud of you, and thank you. It's very important stuff.
Thank you. I really
Thank you
appreciate
for
it.
coming on today.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, that's it for Religion and Life for this week. I hope you'll join us again on App TV as we continue to explore the relationship between religion, culture, and society. Until next time, this is Ozzy Ostwald.